Hello, and welcome back. I'm Roy Gerstenberger from First Person Services, and this is DeLovely, a podcast featuring conversations with people who are creative, committed, and curious about building whole communities where diversity and inclusion is celebrated. For this episode, we start off with a quiz. Don't worry, it's just 4 questions, and when you're done, I'll introduce you to a really smart and interesting person. First, do you know your Developmental Disabilities Council? Anyone? Yeah, they're just like belly buttons. Everyone has one, and you'll find one in every state in the U.S. They were created and charged with engaging in 3 main activities: systems change, capacity building, and advocacy. Question number 2. How are they created? Well, the DD Councils were authorized through a piece of legislation called the Developmental Disabilities Assistance and Bill of Rights Act. We think of it as the DD Act. The purpose of the Act is to assure that people with disabilities and their families participate in the design of and access to needed community services, individualized supports, and other forms of assistance that promote self-determination, independence, productivity, and integration and inclusion in all facets of community life through culturally competent programs. Congress passed the first act in 1963. In the years that followed, it was amended several times, passed through reauthorization from Congress every few years, and in 1970, the reauthorization of the DD Act, the Congress decided to strengthen state efforts to coordinate and integrate services for individuals with developmental disabilities. So, the Congress established and authorized funding for DD councils in each state. And question number 3, what are the other partner organizations in your state that were also created by the DD Act? Well, besides the DD councils, there's the University Centers for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities Education, Research and Service. Sometimes you see them listed as UCEDDs or UCEDs. They're unique among the AIDD program grantees in that they're affiliated with universities, allowing them to serve as liaisons between academia and the community. Then there's the state protection and advocacy systems. They're dedicated to the ongoing fight for the personal and civil rights of people with disabilities. And question number 4. Have you contacted your DD council to get help or to get involved or just to say thank you for the work that you do? Well, it's a good idea. So my guest today is Kirsten Murphy. She's the executive director for the DD Council in Vermont. Remember the systems change, capacity building, and advocacy goals of your council? Well, Kirsten describes how those are the focus in Vermont and your state as well. You'll hear about projects to bring the voice of people who get support and their families into the decision-making arenas. And we hear about something called payment reform. That's the term that's used in Vermont. A version of this conversation is happening in pretty much every system now, and Vermont has its own path. So let me introduce you. Kirsten, thank you very much for meeting with me today, being our guest on the DeLovely podcast.
Great to be here, Rory. Thank you so much.
It's a new year, and we have an opportunity to look at 2020. I know the DD Council is always very active and has a lot of plans in place. Things that have been started in 2019 that might be coming to fruition in 2020.
Yeah,
but what does the year look like?
Yeah, we're excited about it. We're in year 4 of what is a 5-year cycle for us in terms of implementing our 5-year state plan. And starting in 19 was sort of the year of the story and storytelling. And we're looking forward to building on that. Last fall, we ran some workshops that helped give self-advocates and family members some skills about how to tell your story in a way that helps move systems change forward. So impactful storytelling, not the story of your whole life, but one snippet that really can bring an issue to life and make a decision maker see what lived experience is, how that sheds light on the issue. So that was a start, and now we're holding a storytelling contest. We're soliciting stories from individuals and families and allies, and we're going to take those stories and we're going to select the top 10 and host an evening of storytelling on February 20th at the State House. We've been looking for a different way to talk to our lawmakers, someplace outside of committee, someplace where we can just share our experience and not be as focused on, I'm about to be grilled by the chair. So that's a project we're very excited about. Of course, we'll be having Disability Awareness Day in early March, and we're going to be very active at the legislature with our policy analyst, Susan Aronoff, doing what we're calling Make a Date with Susan. We're inviting self-advocates and family members to just reach out to Susan, and she will be happy to arrange to spend some time with them at the State House, either just learning what a committee does or meeting their elected officials at lunch. We've been challenged by some lawmakers to have a stronger presence in the State House, but then when we come in a large group, that isn't always very effective either. So we're trying to find ways to be more of a steady, smaller presence.
So the storytelling, is that something that's open to the public?
Absolutely. Anyone. I mean, we're looking for stories. The theme is Be the Change, and we want them to be related to disability, and they need to be basically true stories. Other than that, we're accepting them in pretty much any format from 3 to 5 minutes. As what we're looking for. And, people can send us a script or a video or, whatever, and then suggest how they might want to share it in a performance type setting. But it would be a very low-key kind of performance. It would be in the cafeteria and, just people sitting around and sharing stories the way that traditional societies have done. So.
In that one-on-one type of format that can work with legislators, as you say. Did you do training this last year for storytelling? You had some workshops, I believe.
Yeah, we did, and we were so lucky because we were able to partner with Vermont Story Lab, which has some incredible skill in this area. And one of their lead storytellers is Representative Mary Beth Redmond. And she's a member of the House Human Services Committee. And so we were partnering with her to sort of find out how can stories impact lawmakers and how can we be effective at doing that. And she's a former journalist and had wonderful insights to share with us.
So as a result of the story event, and that date again?
February 20th of 2020.
2020. As a result of that, you hope that legislators will come away with a better understanding of
people's experiences. And we're not prejudging positive, negative. We're just sharing what really are the experiences. We have other occasions to ask them for things. We'll do that somewhere else. We just want them to understand our community better.
And understand those constituents.
Yeah, exactly.
I see. Tell me more about the Making a Date with Susan. That sounds like a great opportunity.
I think it's going to be. So one of the best ways to get a little bit of attention from your lawmaker is to come to the State House and just send them a little note and say, I'm here, can you make 5 minutes for me in the cafeteria? And that's probably one of the most productive things you can do. It also gives people an opportunity to have the State House demystified for them. Susan can explain, well, this is this set of committees, and this is how you send a note with the page, and here's how the process works, and it's just a lot more hands-on when you're there learning about it. So we've reached out, of course, to our leadership, our participants in the Vermont Leadership Series, who are 23 this year, are getting certified as advocates and leaders. And then also our council members, but anyone in the public really that has an interest in disability issues, we'd welcome them to come. And it doesn't have to be our traditional issues. Maybe you're somebody who struggles with transportation because you're not a driver. Maybe you'd like to come learn about the Transportation Committee and see who the people are on it and who the chair is.
And so Susan can sit down and provide sort of a personalized explanation.
Exactly. And, she'd find out in advance what you're interested in doing and kind of schedule her time in the State House around supporting you and doing the business she always does of being there to monitor the bills that we're paying attention to.
What a great resource. I've heard Representative Teresa Wood talk about the People's House. That this is a place that, in fact, Vermonters should feel comfortable coming to.
Absolutely.
And as you say, finding your representative, having a conversation, telling a story.
Yeah.
And Susan can give some of the technical background that they may be missing.
Absolutely, yeah, and just facilitate that, because it is a busy place, and you need to know a little bit of how to negotiate it, but it's also a place that your elected officials do welcome you to be there.
Sure.
They really do.
So looking forward, you're in your 4th year of your 5-year plan. So you're really focused on the activities for this next year. What will be happening in Vermont forward?
Well, along with the Storytelling Project, we are partnering with the Vermont Center for Independent Living, the Governor's Council on the Employment of People with Disabilities, and with public assets. And we were able to blend some funding together to ask public assets to do a guided research project on the employment of people with disabilities. One of the things our council has really wanted to understand is the situation for those Vermonters with developmental disabilities who don't receive home and community-based services. So they don't have a package of people that help them in the community or on the job. And that's most Vermonters who came up through the special education system and have a developmental disability but don't qualify for adult services. What's their situation like? And we know that they have marked health disparities, so they suffer from disease far more often. And we are aware from national data that they're much more likely to live in poverty and to be underemployed. Mm-hmm. So here we are, a state with a workforce crisis, that's desperate for workers.
Yeah.
And so we want to understand what are the barriers to employment for that group of people and what can we do to position them as part of the solution for Vermont's workforce issues.
So at this point, is it data collection or information collecting?
It is information collecting, but one of the things that I love about public assets is they're always thinking about how you're going to frame that information.
So that it's useful.
And yeah, so that it's useful and understandable. So, we're investing a significant amount of money and we don't want a long treatise. What we want is 6 pages.
I see.
With highly graphic kind of presentation that can help bring home key points. And the partners in the project will be part of the conversation about how to frame the information. So they, Public Assets has all the technical expertise, but individuals who live with disability and allies and family members will be helping to shape what kind of campaign can come out of that.
I see. And that will be the next step.
That'll be the next step, yeah. So we look forward to having the research piece wrapped up by September, and then we'll have year 5 to use it as a campaign tool.
And will you be using that with your ongoing conversation with the legislature and with the Department of Human Services? Or?
Yes, and I suspect it's also going to contribute to what we think about as priorities when we come up with our next 5-year state plan.
I see.
Every 5 years we have to kind of renew ourselves, and I see us very likely to go strongly in the direction of employment.
I see.
So this helps lay the groundwork for that as well.
Do you anticipate any particular challenges with that with regard to being able to access that information?
I don't think the raw data is going to be a problem. I think that barriers that people experience have to do with the priority setting within vocational rehabilitation and perhaps maybe a need to get more technical assistance in some best practices so that VR can stretch itself across a broader range of people's ability.
I see.
And so we're not looking to wag the finger at anybody. We're looking to be part of the solution. I think that's where we might run into some challenges.
I see.
And VR, I should have mentioned, VR is a partner on the project.
It's also a partner. Yeah. Is there anything that people who are in the general public or in particular sectors in Vermont can do to help you with that effort?
Well, I think the broader thing I need help with and would love to hear from people, we're starting to gather our information for our comprehensive needs assessment for the state. So if you're a member of the public who's experiencing a developmental disability, a disability in general, or you have a family member and you have something to share about your experience, we do want to hear it. And we would love for you to be in touch and share that with us, because we collect both statistical data for our needs assessment, but more importantly, we do focus groups and we collect the stories of people. Then my members take all that information, our council members, and they set the priorities. What are the issues the state most needs to address in the next 5 years? But we want to hear from all over the state.
So if somebody has information they would like to share, It sounds like there's a variety of ways they can share that, and you can inform them of those opportunities.
Exactly. So it might be that the best thing for them is to come to a focus group, or it might be that we need to do a telephone interview. We'll see what works for that person, or they might want to write me a letter if that's their choice. But we would figure out the right way for that to get into the mix.
Very good. So turning our attention to the system, there is some things that are changing in our support system in Vermont, that it's multifaceted. But what do you see emerging? 2020 will be another active year in that regard.
Well, I think this has been, I've been sharing some of our projects, but of course a core of what we're doing is participating in what has been called developmental services payment reform. I prefer to call it developmental services payment and practice reform, because I think that there are aspects that either will impact practice or specifically do target changes in practice. So we've been a pretty active part of that conversation. The payment component has centered around 3 different issues. One has been the state's feeling that we need to use a statistically normed instrument to assess people's support needs. And I've had experience, as you have in New Hampshire, watching the system move over to using the supports intensity scale. That's the direction we're leaning. No tool is perfect.
That's also called the SIS.
The SIS or the SIS. But I like that it's committed to measuring need and not focused on someone's diagnostic label. And then we make a whole bunch of assumptions about what that label means, instead of thinking about, well, what does this individual, what are their strengths, and then what do they need support with? So there has been a lot of conversation about how to make that tool work in Vermont. A second piece of the conversation has had to do with how agencies take in the money that they will then use to pay for services. And frankly, when we were a system of 300 people, a kind of an individualized, I'm going to cut you $20 for this and $15 for that, and that kind of, that might have made sense when it was 300 people, but when it's 3,000 plus people, that's a little more complicated and a little less efficient. And so, but for the state to do that, what was really surprising to me is we as advocates could not say cleanly to our decision makers, what does it cost to deliver this particular service? And to do that, you do a cost-based accounting. There are people who get paid to figure this out. And it gives you an opportunity to build into the rate for each service things that you normally couldn't bill for, which are critically important to delivering quality service. So before, and as we're under our previous payment structure, an agency couldn't, really go bill the state for an hour of training. They'd have to figure out how to cover that some other way. And yet you can't run services without training and without supervision and without some of these other activities that aren't directly billable. So coming up with a set of cost-based rates, I think, was more than overdue in the state. And while we can quibble about whether the best numbers were used for figuring out the cost basis in terms of mileage reimbursement or those kind of details, I think the project of building those rates was incredibly important. And then when we as advocates last year put in our comments and said, well, I think these assumptions around wages and benefits, I think you're off here, they revised the rates. I don't know if we're ultimately going to be able to use those rates, but I feel like we were heard and the rates feel reasonably fair. So I think that's promising. Now, how that turns into an actual payment structure, that's something that the state is still working on, and we'll be following that in the year to come. And then the third component had to do with sort of computer systems and how agencies, at the end of the day, made sure that if they had promised that John was receiving an hour of service, if they were paid for John's hour of service, in fact, John received that hour of service. And
that's the accountability
piece. The accountability piece. And, I know consumers in our system who are disadvantaged when there is flexibility around that. Mary didn't receive her services because John needed more that month. But Mary's quiet and isn't a complainer. And so Mary routinely doesn't receive her service. I just think a system that's more accountable to the agreements that we make with individual people in service is an incredibly important step. Mm-hmm. So while certainly nobody loves dealing with implementing new computer systems, I do think that the project strikes me as sound. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So that was the payment reform piece. Mm-hmm. And as I say, it's several years in the works because you have to come up with the models and test them, and then you have to change rules, and you have to change possibly even statute. The other component that I just have seen as critical is this, people are saying in Vermont that it's a new regulation by the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare. It's not that new. Back in 2014, in March of 2014, Medicaid said that case management services must be delivered without undue conflict of interest. The indicator that there was not undue conflict of interest would be that the agency providing the service is not the same agency that's providing the case management. Now, unfortunately, the rule did not define what case management is, and in Vermont, that is many, many things. So that created some challenges for Vermont. But let's remember this was the rule in 2014, and we had several years of advocating to the state that the rule even applied to Vermont. So first the state argued that it didn't apply because we have a different type of waiver, mm-hmm. and I knew from national conversations that argument was unlikely to prevail. Eventually we learned that the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare had pushed back and said, no, you need to pay attention to the rule. It applies in Vermont. And at which point we actually work with legal aid to do a public records request. And nobody likes to do those. And certainly nobody likes to read 2,000 pages of redacted documents. But we became aware that there were a lot of internal conversations, focused conversations, about requesting that Vermont be excused from that rule. Well, in order to be excused, that has to be a public conversation. That can't be a private conversation. So at that point, we really needed to say, what's the public process here to discuss how we are going to come into compliance as a state? And that brought us all the way up until about a year ago.
Okay.
And the state is, to its credit, engaged in a robust public process about how are we going to come into compliance. Now, it struck a lot of people as brand new news. What do you mean my case manager can't work for the agency that, There was a lot of pushback from some people. It kind of boiled down to two groups. There are some people who've had wonderful experiences in Vermont's very individualized, values-informed system. Change can only for that group mean threat, right? Mm-hmm. I love my case manager. I've had my case manager for the last 10 years. I don't want to change my case manager. Other people, and this would be most of the council members actually, have come into the system much more recently. They haven't had stability with their case manager. They haven't had a positive experience. In fact, they've experienced the kinds of conflicts of interest that CMS is talking about. Being steered toward a service that might be convenient for the agency, but not the ideal fit for the individual. Having an inability to bring forward a complaint or concern because you feel like anything from I just don't want to hurt the feelings of the case manager, or I'm not going to be heard because my home provider is supervised by my case manager, or there might be reprisals, or I could be seen as a complainer, and I'm highly dependent on this agency cooperating with me. Mm-hmm. So we heard a lot of stories about that there was a real problem to solve. Mm-hmm. The Vermont was not exempt from human nature. Just like every other state, there were in fact conflicts of interest, and we needed to address them. So the state is now working on a range of ways to come into compliance, and it's going to take more than one thing. I think that the state is going to move in the direction of saying, hey, Medicaid, some people in our state really want to keep their case manager, and some people don't. What if we offer people a choice between an independent agency that's case management and keeping something within their own agency. Choice is really foundational in Vermont. Go ahead and try it. It's an argument you can have. I'm not hopeful, based on the record, that the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare have turned down most states that asked for some kind of variance from this rule. But it's a reasonable place to start, and it reflects what the state heard in a whole series of, I think I went to 6 out of 7 public hearings. Mm-hmm. So that's a fair thing, but that isn't sufficient. So, and I find the other extra protections far more important. One thing the rule is absolutely clear about is that the steps in the process that involve onboarding someone into services, so bringing someone who's new to the system, whether they just moved here or they're coming up through the special education system, their clinical eligibility and their needs assessment can no longer be done by the agency that's going to deliver their services. That's overdetermined in the rule, and the state has to change that. And I think that's going to bring greater fairness to our system, more attention to using evaluation tools that are consistent and reliable. So that's a good thing. I still don't think that's sufficient. I think that there are a couple other components that need to be in place. One is that I feel people need independent options counseling, similar to what they receive if you're a senior in Vermont. If you're an older Vermonter, you have the ability to go and get independence options counseling about what are the range of things you could do as you're aging and might need some support services. Right now, you go to the agency that delivers service and you may not be told all of the range of things that you might have access to. And I have heard for the longest time from families just complete frustration. I have a member that says, everything's a secret in this state. And for whatever reason, we're just not very good at kind of making the facts clear. And just so I'm a big advocate for some options counseling. I think that counseling can be delivered by peers. Mm-hmm. I think other self-advocates are some of the best people to share with their peers. What are the options, and why might you be more interested in living independently from being with your parents or with a home provider or not with a home provider? I think that they're in a great position with training to be part of that solution. Mm-hmm. The one I want to get to, though, is this need for an independent developmental services advocate. Mm-hmm. So the fancy term that we use for that role is ombudsman. It's this very dated kind of Scandinavian word. So if you're in the Choices for Care program, you have the opportunity to go to the long-term care ombudsman, which is an office of 5 people, actually, and it's supervised by an attorney at legal aid. And for your day-to-day types of concerns, not abuse and neglect, there's a good system for that. Not fighting about whether were determined eligible for services. There's also a system for that. But for everything in between, my home provider won't let me have friends over. I'm entitled to lock my room, but my home provider doesn't want to drill through her door. My case manager isn't hearing that I want a job. Whatever it is, there is, I think, an effective role for an independent advocate who's going to be centered on what does the individual in services, what are they asking for, what do they need, and how can I help that person move to resolution. Doesn't mean they're always going to get what they want, but move that to resolution. And it shouldn't matter which gate you came in. Mm-hmm. If you came in one system, you can have the ombudsman for long-term care, but if you come through developmental services, you really can't. We have a disability law project, but they've never had the capacity to field those sort of middling level types of concerns, which are the things that most of the consumers I talk to, it's what they talk about and complain about. It's what is most on their mind. Mm-hmm. So we're even going as far as to try to introduce legislation this session to see if we can't move this idea forward. And it's not even terribly expensive. Mm-hmm. We've done the math. We think we could come up with a credible program for under $250,000, maybe not even that, but we really, it's a gap in our system that needs to be closed. So
this is something that may be appearing this year. It sounds like it's in the works.
We're absolutely going to have a conversation with the legislature about it this year.
And something else that people can find out more about by contacting the DD Council.
Absolutely, and we'd love it to hear from people if they have thoughts about it. If they've experienced a conflict of interest or an inability to have their particular concern heard, we'd love to know about that. That would be great.
You've mentioned a few terms that if someone goes on their web browser and searches, they'll find some references across the country. You mentioned conflict-free case management, options counseling.
Options counseling, yep.
Those are happening in other states, and ombudsman projects you say are happening in other systems in Vermont?
Yes, particularly in Choices for Care for older Vermonters, but several other states, including I think a model in Washington state, have recently implemented independent advocates.
I see.
In part because there's something in this new conflict of interest free case management that implies the need for that check and balance on the system.
And is that a peer options counseling?
No, that's more like an ombuds function in the state of Washington. But
okay.
I think the peer thing is particularly ripe in Vermont because we have one of the most robust statewide self-advocacy organizations. In fact, the council's already approved money to do an initial training. Because of all the payment reform, we haven't been able to engage the state in matching that approved funding to help us get the training off the ground. But we're ready, and I'm very hopeful that before this 5-year cycle is over, we will have a group of trained advocates who can possibly, through GMSA or through some entity, provide some options counseling, maybe even some assistance in service planning, just as a peer to accompany people when they're getting their service plans made.
That's fascinating. Has anybody brought up concerns about you're adding another level of bureaucracy or this is another person I have to speak to? Do you get any pushback on that?
I think where I've heard that argument has been around the idea that there be an independent case management entity, and also the fact that there need to be independent evaluators, right? Because especially for the needs assessment, the state will they have issued a request for proposal and are asking that an entity with a presence in Vermont agree to be the group that implements and does these support intensity scale assessments. So those add different layers, but they're not new functions. They were functions that were all located in a single agency, and now they might be spread out a little bit, but it's probably fairer and there's greater consumer protection when you separate those functions out over several entities, rather than, as attractive as one-stop shopping is, that fully integrated continuum of care within a single agency also does tempt one to engage in the kinds of practices that are what Medicaid wants to make sure doesn't happen. And so I think that, it's time for us to take a hard look at our system and see, can we create and reinvent some checks and balances that make it fairer, more equitable.
Interesting. So a great time for people to be more engaged with the DD Council.
I hope so.
It sounds like you're an ally there for that to happen, to mediate contacts with people and to connect with legislature and see some action.
That's absolutely. And the other role we've played is it's been really difficult for the state to get input on payment reform. Because it's technical, it's hard to understand. And we've worked hard on ways to break it down for people and to also give people safe spaces to share their concerns. Because frankly, in open public hearings, we had many families and self-advocates tell us they didn't feel they could speak in a meeting where staff from their agency were half the audience.
Can be hard.
Yeah,
And that's complicated because some of their presence is there to assist people in accessing it in the first place.
Of course. It's very complicated, and it doesn't mean that there would really be reprisals. The thing about conflict of interest is if you perceive it, then it is real. right? Nobody has to actually act on it.
The appearance
of conflict of interest is a conflict of interest.
So one of the positive characteristics of what you have been describing is what we have here in the state of Vermont is there's many things that we want to preserve. Vermont has been at the process of strengthening communities, advancing community inclusion, making sure that people are part of their communities for many, many years. Yes. And these are the payment reform that Vermont is going through is not one of inventing a community system. It's very much wanting to preserve the things that have been able to happen in the past. And it seems that every sector has that in mind at one level or another.
Absolutely. When we as a council first stepped forward into the payment reform world, the first thing we did is lay down a set of principles that we felt were the most important things, whatever decisions got made. And they had to do with things like there must still be flexibility in the system. That employment is a critical way to connect with your community. It needs to be front and center in the kind of supports that we offer people. Families and individuals should still have the option of managing their own services. That's something that not a lot of Vermonters do, but it should be preserved that people can do that. Those are the kind of things that we wanted to really stand on. And of course, individualized services that are about meaningful connection to the community rather than just where you live. That's in fact where the CMS rules that everyone is kind of a little upset about, those started back in 2009 when the Administration for Community Living, which is actually the group that funds the DD Council, partnered with the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, the Self-Advocates Becoming Empowered, SABE, it's a national group. There were a couple of Vermonters involved in this. They took a group of self-advocates and sat them down for a weekend and said, we've never defined what it means to live in the community. CMS has been funding that for a while now, but we never sat down and said, what does it mean? And I just went back and looked at that paper again recently. It's called Keeping the Promise. Self-advocates talking about the meaning of community living. And it's an incredible vision, and that is what is driving the desire for there to be some checks and balances so that when people say, my services need to look this way, they are heard. And that was the thing that the self-advocates said in that brainstorming session was, it's about my voice being heard and what's important to me. And it's not just a building somewhere. It's not about where the building is located. You can be just as isolated, in, I'm using air quotes, in the community as in an institution. So
we'll put a link to that in the show notes.
It's a wonderful paper.
That. It is really great. And we'd like to also make sure before we finish up that we give information about how to contact the DD Council.
Absolutely. So the Vermont Developmental Disabilities Council, we have a website, www.ddc.vt, and you'll find us. You can dial 802-828-1310. And again, my name is hard to pronounce. It's Kirsten Murphy. And my email is kirsten.murphy@vermont.gov. And I would love to hear from people.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Kirsten. It's been a pleasure talking with you today.
Thank you so much, Troy. I've really enjoyed it.
It's been a joy. Well, take care and good luck for the rest of the year. And maybe we can meet again 2021.
I'd love that. Thank you.
That's our show for today. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast on your favorite app. Send a recommendation to friends. Like and follow the DeLovely Podcast Facebook page. Spread the word. DeLovely is sponsored by listeners like you. Find us at patreon.com/DeLovely, where membership levels could get you video conference staff support and custom digital audio for your nonprofit. Pitch in to keep this podcast going strong, highlighting people who are supporting whole communities. And thank you. Have fun, everybody.